طيب, so first things first, welcome to our beautiful session that will discuss خلينا نسميها theoretical aspect of soldering. طيب, هذا السيشن إن شاء الله راح يدعم exercise that we will perform or the workshop that we will perform tomorrow in the upcoming 2 days as well. So first thing, let's discuss briefly what is soldering, okay, and why we're doing this at the moment. طبعا keep in mind إنه I am directing my discussion towards electrical engineering students on a main basis. So some of the things that I mentioned will not apply to other students إذا كانوا موجودين from other majors. However, we can consider, طيب, ولا we should consider that the most fundamental skill that any بغير color of the pen, we can consider that one of the most fundamental skills for any electrical engineer is mastering an ability to solder electronics. It's a very simple skill, yet it's not easy to master, and it is actually very beneficial for you guys to realize how the skill or even to understand its principles. Remember that during within the soldering workshop, the purpose of this workshop is that to promote your skills so that in the future, if you're building, let's say, a robot, or if you're building a PCB circuit, you should be capable of actually constructing the circuitry of HADL system or of this project, and you will feel some sort of achievement as you have done everything yourself. Okay. Final thing to note is that soldering, okay, يعني has a trait. وهذا the trait is that it is actually fun to learn. I remember myself when I learned soldering, it was really fun. I enjoyed it. طيب. And it's not a difficult skill to master. يعني overall, it's just understanding the principles, well, how you should do it, and it's all about exercising هذا principle. Now, if we want to realize soldering on a let's call it on the most basic form, طيب, it is as presented in front of you, where the idea is that you have something called a soldering iron. طيب, you have a circuit board اللي هو بالأخضر هنا. You have your component, which is in this case an LED. You have a copper pads. طيب, هذه copper pads are existent on the PCB or on the circuit board. And then you have an element that is called a solder. The idea here is, first step, you should heat up your soldering iron, طيب, which is this one. So you plug it in, wait for it to heat. Your second step is to touch a soldering iron, okay, with the copper pad اللي موجودة هنا, and heat the pad itself. And then your third step is to add the solder, to add the solder component, ولا the solder material within هذا copper pad, and this will form a joint that will attach البن حق الكومبوننت اللي هو هذا with ايش؟ with the copper part of the PCB. It's a very simple procedure. However, هذا presentation will discuss the fundamentals so that when you start to perform what we have just discussed, you understand how should you approach الsteps هذه, يعني what you should and what you shouldn't do. Okay, and the best way to do this is by understanding elements and tools and the safety precautions and also the methodology of soldering والآخرين. So we're going to discuss all of them within the presentation. Now, first things first, we're going to start with a simple soldering iron. So what we have in front of us is a soldering iron اللي موجود في الpicture هنا. طيب. And it's a tool that basically allows once plugged in, it allows electricity to flow into the wire and heat up التip اللي موجودة عندنا هنا. Okay. Now usually this is defined as the most common tool. طيب in soldering you'll find a lot of variations من هذا tool and they can heat up to 400 degrees. Now I'm not going to read what's in front of you. This will be shared with you later on if you want to review it or read it. Also within a soldering iron there also exists something called soldering station. الفرق ما بين soldering iron and soldering station is that a soldering station includes other tools that help you to perform a soldering in an easier fashion. And the way to look at this is that you have the same methodology. هنا you have a wire طيب في silk that you plug in, and then you have a soldering tool. يعني الألوان هنا أنا عارف فين برسم. ناخذ أخضر. And you can see clearly إنه this is your soldering iron. However, there exists a stand for it, so you can plug it in. There exists some temperature control where you can control the temperature at which your solder iron is expected to be. طيب. So these are the two elements that are available usually when you are performing, well, when you are soldering. Now, one critical thing to note for is iron tips, well, the tips that you are using to solder. And the way to look at this is by understanding the method that you will perform to solder any component with a PCB circuit. يعني if we look in front of us, we have a variation of tips. طيب. These are called tips. This part من a soldering iron is usually defined as a tip. Okay. And most commonly known, there exists a conical tip and there exists a chisel tip. The difference between the two is that the conical follows a cone shape. Well, I think you guys know what a cone shape is. And it has a very pointy end, such as this one and that one. A chisel tip has a flat end that is usually used for large components. If you have a very large component, you can use those. If you have a very small component, then you can use the conical tips, and it varies depending on a requirement حق circuitry in the component itself. Now, also, in addition to L tips, there exists a very important component, well, a very important element during an exercise of a soldering, which is either a brass or a conventional sponge. Now, if you recall just a few seconds ago, طيب هتلاحظوا إنه في الستيشن في هذا السبونج. Okay, usually some stations come with a sponge, other stations don't come with a sponge. And the reason of having a sponge, is فقط to clean التip. هذه الغاية الوحيدة اللي احنا نستخدم فيها السبونج or البراس. طيب يعني هذه two work just fine. Now one thing to note إنه when we say we want to clean the tip, it is actually performing desensitization of الأوكسيدation اللي موجودة في التip. لأنه once you are at high temperatures في التip and there exists some solder طيب that is surrounding a portion of the tip, this will degrade the quality ولا الماتيريال اللي موجود في التip. To prevent this from happening, you can clean the tip by just wiping the tip itself على either السبونج ولا البراس. It's just يعني you literally wipe it. كأنك بتمسح يعني طرف قلم ولا كأنك بتمسح فرشة. You just wipe it off and you're good to go. Now, when you لما احنا ان شاء الله نسوي الورك شوب حتلاحظ انه بعض الاحيان وانت بتشتغل هذه الامور حتتلهي عنها. لكن البرنسبل هنا انه you understand that you should do that and try to remember that you should always do cleaning للتip every single time you are soldering. انا ما بقول انه لما تبدا في السولدرينج you clean التip، لا. Every single time you solder either a component ولا a hole في PCB circuit, you clean the tip to شو اسمه to make sure that the tip itself is clean, and at the same time you are removing any oxidization موجودة في التip. And this also helps, if you're doing it, this also helps to transfer the heat من التip to the PCB. طيب, so it has two factors in it. Now, also, if, for example, we don't have a soldering station, there exists something called a soldering iron stand, which has it's preemptive. ايش بيسوي هذا الشيء. The idea of it is that you can place a solder inside هذا stand. However, اللي أبغى أوضحه هنا إنه you will see this during the workshop. As you're soldering, you forget where to put an iron tip ولا الأيرون device. فبعض الأحيان تلاقي نفسك حطيته كده على الطاولة وتنسى موضوع إنه في شيء اسمه stand ولا you have to be careful لأنه التip is at really high degrees. يعني it could be 250 ولا 300 degrees. It will burn any flammable object. But to prevent this, you should always remember, well, you should always try to focus on, if you're not using an iron, you directly place it where it should belong, which is either the stand or somewhere safe. You do not trouble it on the table, nor do you keep it in your hand for no reason. You can damage yourself, or you can burn yourself, or you can damage the equipment اللي موجودة حولها. طيب. The other portion هنا is the solder itself, well, the material that we use to connect the pin plus the PCB. طيب, remember when I say pin, I just mean a lead that is available within a component. يعني for example, a resistor, إذا جيت شفت resistor, it should be تقريبا زي كده شكله. It's a component that looks like this. Okay, so these are regarded as either pins or lead. It's just a lead. طبعا it doesn't come that way. هو حيجيك زي كده ولا حيجيكم زي كده, and then you will have to kind of slant leads so that you can insert it. Anyhow, what you must understand for solder material is that it is a metal alloy material. طيب, the purpose of هذا material is to create a permanent bond between electrical parts and the PCB copper pad اللي شفناها فوق. Also, هذا الماتيريال comes in the some of, مو كل الأنواع, في من أنواع, لكن one type comes with a lead free composite, where usually the material itself that is lead free comes in a diameters of 0.32 inch or and 0.062 inch. And one thing to realize here, it's a very slim diameter, so therefore it is very small, and you have to be careful with it in terms of quantity. Also, what you must consider critically, طيب, إنه inside the solder core, inside the core of هذا material, there exists sometimes something called as a flux. هذا flux helps to promote a bonding that happens between the pin and the PCB. And at the same time, هذا bonding happens due to a variation, ولا خلينا نقول الراتيو between the tin to the copper اللي موجود في الالوي. And usually, very commonly, the ratio is 60-40 with respect to tin and copper. طيب. Now, based on that, you have to realize there exist other types. Other types of solders of solder material is available that also include some acid composite, and you have to be very careful with such materials لأنه these are toxic based composites. طيب, فإحنا اللي موجود عندنا في المعمل هو ال 60-40 ratio من التن والالوي that is lead free. طيب, فالحمد لله there's no toxic fumes coming out of it لأنه you'll be dealing at 200 degrees Celsius. However, if you want to exercise this at home ولا يعني you got excited وتبغى تجيب solder iron عندك وتشتغل آخره. Be careful of what you're buying in terms of solder material. Now we come to an important variation, طيب, where we have to realize ايش type of PCBs that we can use during our soldering exercise. Usually there exist two types of PCBs. The first type is a through-hole component PCB, and the second type is a surface mount component PCB. A through-hole component PCB اللي هو عبارة عن PCB طيب فيه له فتحات، وهذه الفتحات can be utilized to insert pins of the components. Okay, whereas the surface mount components are usually a PCB that does not have any holes but have some it has some paddings, وعلى البادنج هذه في الكونكشن حقة السيركتري as a layer وليس فتحة. Okay, for understanding the difference between two is important. A surface mount soldering is more skill based, يعني you have to be really skilled to شو اسمه to طبعا usually these are shortcutted as SMDs. You have to be really skilled to solder SMD components لأنه they're extremely small. يعني شوفوا لو تلاحظوا قديش صغر يعني هذا literally these two dots here. يعني أنا بختار لون أخضر والباك جراوند أخضر. دقيقة نغير لكم اللون. إذا تلاحظوا هنا تقدروا تشوفوا كده small padding. Literally here you connect a resistor. It's extremely tiny, so you have to be super careful and super stable مع الايرون tip. Otherwise you can screw up the circuitry itself. احنا عندنا في الجامعة we have a through hole components. طيب حتكون في فتحة, you plug in a component and then you start to solder. Now PCB handling. It's not as critical in workshop, but it is important to understand. When you're dealing with sensitive devices for circuitry, usually it is always recommended to hold the PCB من الأطراف الجانبية اللي موجودة هنا, and never to hold it ولا never to put your fingers on the circuitry itself. وأنا كده بطرح سؤال. Why do you think so? Why do you think it's bad to شو اسمه انك تمسك البي سي بي باصابعك على من ناحيه الكونكشن والسيركتري؟ ليش تتوقع هذا الشيء يعتبر سيء؟ ولا ايش الافكت اوف دوينج ذس؟
تفضل جهاد.
كيف؟
ايوه
تفضل جهاد.
ايوه معك. اول شيء ممكن انك تسبب بضرر للمكونات المتركبه. ثاني شيء ممكن يكون في كهرباء ساكنه، عفوا مو كهرباء، بتكون كهرباء متخزنه داخل المكثفات وما تفرغت، فممكن تسبب بلدعه بسيطه. ممكن تسبب خطوره اكثر باقي القطع حسب علمي.
اول شيء شو اسمه that's very good, thank you all of you. You are correct. طيب بس انا من my perspective خليها تلدعكم كهرباء شويه عشان تصحصح. طيب I'm not worried about هذا البارت. However سبحان الله يد الانسان لو تلاحظ نفسك ولا لو تمسك يدك كده، انا دحين جالس امسك يدي، حتشوف انه اليد طبيعتها فيها زي كأنها مزيته كده، في غشاء زيتي يحمي لك جلدك. يعني انت لما تتروش ولا لما تسبح فترة مرة طويلة if you remember تلاقي كده الجلد في الأصابع كده يختلف بعد ما تخرج من المسبح، لأنه هذا الزيت starts to decompose on the skin itself. So when you're holding a PCB with your hands and they're not clean ولا there exists هذا الماتيريال that is protecting your skin, it will actually be transferred to a PCB itself. وهذا الماتيريال is actually conductive, which is very funny. So you can actually cause a short في البي سي. طبعا هذا اذا كان السيركت مره سنسيتيف، يعني زي هذا اللي موجود هنا، بس مو لما يكون شيء عام يعني مثلا ريزيستر كذا دي لا. But you can short two circuitries within a PCB just فقط من الاويلز اللي موجوده في الفينجر تيبس. That's a fun fact for you guys. Anyhow, also what we need to account for انه احنا we're human beings. We only have two hands. ويعني ما شاء الله هذه two hands can do so much. However, we would prefer to have a third hand. Therefore, usually there always exists a helping hand tool that helps you to either place a component or orient a PCB in a specific way. It's a helping hand. فيها alligator tips. You can you can try to fixate a PCB at a certain degree or at a certain angle, so on and so forth. So you should always use them to your advantage. Now, also what you should account for based على elements اللي أخذناها فوق is something called tinning the tip, where tinning the tip is basically prepping your soldering iron to solder a component onto the PCB. And the way to do this is exactly as explained before, where you could either have a sponge or you could have a brass sponge. What you should always do, what you should always remember, is that tinning the tip is something that you have to regularly do as you're soldering. Do not forget about tinning the tip. It's very critical. طيب, it helps the performance of the heat transfer. It also helps to maintain the quality of the tip عشان لا يصير له degradation مع oxidation. And it's an easy thing to do. And the way to do it is that when you have a sponge موجودة عندكم مثلا في الstation, طيب, this sponge will be filled with a little bit of water عشان تكون كده شوية يعني ما تكون dense مع water, ما تكون مثلا saturated with water, just a little bit, and you just wipe it out. Okay, so you just make sure. ايوه صح. Before you do so, always remember that when you're utilizing an iron, make sure that the iron is attached properly. ايش يعني properly? iron tip هذا طيب is an element within an iron that is removable. Do not heat it up, and then it's not really screwed in very well, and when you come to wipe it out, it will start to slant, well, it starts to move around and it's not stable. So make sure that it is attached properly, and then once you heat up your solder to the specific degree of a device, you always just have to wipe the tip of a soldering iron زي ما هو موضح هنا on the sponge, and that's it. طيب, once you wipe it, before you start the soldering procedure, what you can do is actually hold the solder iron in one hand and touch a solder with the tip of the iron so that you spread a tiny portion of the solder على iron itself. هذا البروسيجر طيب ولا this way helps to do one thing and one thing only. It makes a soldering tip, it surrounds a flux around the soldering tip so that it becomes a lot easier when you start to heat the copper pad اللي موجودة في PCB. وهتلاحظوا الفرق. يعني it's very difficult to explain it without going into detail, بس in a nutshell it helps the performance حق iron tip. And this usually is done يعني only once during a session. But where you keep your iron head clean should be progressive as you're working مع السtation ومع PCB. Also, what you should always remember is that you have to have some ventilation available next to you as you're soldering. لأنه whatever you do, you're working with 200 or roughly 200 degrees of Celsius, and you're working with a material that gets melted at this degree. Most probably there will be some fumes coming out من هذا melting process. The idea is that once you start soldering, make sure the fume extractor the ventilation device is close to an iron device in the solder material itself. So it will extract any of the fumes and it will filter هذه fumes. Okay, there exists a filtering inside. And also during our sessions there exists a first aid kit in every single lab we have. طيب in case of emergencies يعني إن شاء الله الأمور كلها تكون تمام. بس be careful when using iron. أنا إن شاء الله حكون موجود. I will try to supervise بس أنا ما عندي غير عينين. طيب make sure when you're operating هذا device that you are handling it with care. لا يجي على إصبعك لا يجي على يدك. Be careful with it. Also remember to consistently use the stand. If you're not using a solder iron رجع في الستاند حقه لا تخليه طارف على الجنب والى آخره. And another thing is that if you would like, well, if you're afraid, you can bring safety glasses. طيب يعني it's not really necessary, but it's just another measure for precautions, or if you have very sensitive eyes. Now finally, if you feel something unusual, طيب, please notify me as we are working. في people who have يعني sensitive lungs, طيب, they could get a small allergic reaction من الfumes اللي بتخرج once you are soldering. طيب, it's very rare, however it could happen. And the way to prevent this is by utilizing ventilation, and also remember that if you are if you smell fumes for a long period of time, it will actually make you dizzy. فعشان كده utilizing the fume extractor is very important in our session إن شاء الله. Finally, if we come to the posture, طيب, it may seem يعني بصراحة something يعني nonsense when I'm talking about it, but trust me, it does make a difference. Because when you're soldering, either you're standing or sitting on a chair, if you're going to work heavily, well, if you're going to work for a specific period of time, let's say 30-40 minutes, to solder some components, and you're not using a right posture, trust me, it will cause some back nicks. And the way to prevent this is by making sure that your posture as you're working is as straight as you can. Do not lean in to a table. طيب, لأن the first thing, this will have fumes من a melting solder. طيب, and it will make you more exhausted as we progress with time. هذا من experience يعني. طيب, دحين احنا اللي what we did cover is principles اللي احنا مفروض نكون عارفينها وواعيين عنها في soldering in terms of what elements do we have, what materials do we have, ايش الكومبوننتس اللي احنا حنستخدمها عشان تسهل علينا soldering workshop, وفي نفس الوقت what we should do. Okay, now we're going to come to the practice of soldering, and I'm going to talk about it يعني briefly, ما حتعمق فيها لأنه tomorrow you will exercise this yourself, and I think that exercising هذا التكنيك اللي احنا حنوضحها is a lot easier for you to learn than me talking about it while discussing the details حقتها. First things first. طيب, let's say that we have a component. Let's say that we have a PCB. هذا PCB حقنا. طيب, let's say إنه في هذا PCB, well, this is a printed circuit board that is through whole circuit board. طيب, ففي له ايش؟ في له هذه الholes. And let's assume إنه our circuit board is already printed where the circuitry is aligned. طيب يعني كده في له definition للcircuitry اللي موجودة عندنا. If I would like to place a component, طيب, and let's take into our example مثلا resistor. So I'm gonna place the pins of a resistor through هذا الهول. طيب يعني سامحوني على الرسم اللي على قدي بس مشوا حالكم. So I'm gonna place a resistor through هذه الهولز اللي موجودة هنا. And once I flip ال PCB راح يكون عندي this kind of arrangement where I'm gonna look, I can see the leads from the bottom اللي هي هنا. Okay, and what you should do in هذا case if you want to solder is basically push هذا component with your fingers, usually your thumb or your index, push it down and then flip a PCB so you are within هذا view, and once you are within this view slant ولا angle leads by 45 degrees. يعني move this to 45 degrees and move this one also by 45 degrees. The purpose of doing this is to keep a component in its position. يعني أنا بس كده بعكسها من تحت عشان أخلي component في مكانه يثبت وأبدأ إيش؟ أبدأ أسوي soldering. Once you do this, what you should always remember, well, what you should always target is your iron tip. طيب ولا purpose of an iron tip is to heat up الباد اللي موجودة هنا. If you see there exists كده يعني زي الكوبر باد اللي هي مثلا هذا. طيب this is your copper pad اللي موجودة في السيركتري. Your objective is to heat up هذا الكوبر pad, and as you do so يعني you can heat it up for let's say 1 to 3 seconds. It depends على بصراحة ال temperature حق الايرون and your skills. Okay. Once you perform هذا ال heating process, then you insert ال solder to ايش؟ to الكوبر باد وليس الايرون تيب. طيب يعني كأنك كده تبغى لما تدخل السولدر تحاول تدخله في الكوبر باد بدون ما يتلامس مع التيب، لانه البرنسبل here is to heat up the copper pad, okay, and then insert a solder on the copper pad. The copper pad would be at high temperatures and it will melt the solder. Okay, and as soon as it melts around, you remove the iron tip and boom, you are an expert in soldering. Once you've done this, you need to snip the leads. طيب خلاص, once you have completed soldering, you're happy, I'm happy, everybody's happy. You have to snip the excess حق الليد. طيب do not leave it there, then it could break الconnection اللي سويتوها ولا اللي حتسووها بالsolder. And in summary, this is what you should always try to do. You prepare yourself. طيب, okay, so you get everything ready. You have your iron in one hand. يعني كنت ابغى ارسم يد بس ما حاعرف كيف ارسم يد. هذه يدي الأولى وهذه يدي الثانية. Okay, so what you should do is push the iron على الcopper pad, heat up the copper pad. Once it is heated, oops, شو ده معلق. Once it is heated خلاص يعني 1 to 2 seconds ولا depend على iron machine, then you start to insert a solder. It gets fuddling around and until you reach هذا الشيب من الsolder that surrounds the lead, then you're good to go. You remove everything out. Okay. This slide here discusses other variations of components that you can solder, where for example if you have large terminals, so الفتحة مرة كبيرة, you can heat the pad surrounding هذا large terminal by moving an iron machine. زي ما هو موضح هنا كمان. or you could use bigger tips to actually iron الcopper pad. However خلينا نشوف هذا السلايد لأن هذا السلايد مهم. Now how would you know if you did a good practice for soldering or a bad practice? If you have something that looks like this, okay, this is really bad because it seems here that your solder is not in the shape of a copper pad. It's like a slanted thing. I don't know what it is, okay? And this indicates that there is too much of a solder within هذا connection. If your solder takes the shape properly حق الباد, الcopper pad, and there exists يعني a small incline, well, it feels like a small hill, then you're good to go. If it feels like a really small layer, well, a small pad, this is where things are acceptable. But be careful, and if you reduce the amount of a solder, you could end up with something like this or something like that, which is not good enough for the reason that this will be easy to break. يعني any movement ولا any motion في الليد طبعا حيكون شيء جوا هنا. It could break a connection easily. So if your soldering looks something like this, if your soldering looks something like this, this is a very clean job. طيب, you've surrounded the lead properly. There isn't a lot of excess, and the joint will be fully surrounded. However, if you include too much, well, if you don't do it properly with too much heat, for example, well, too much solder material, you could end up with something that resembles as a bad baked cookie. حتكون فيها كده rough surfaces, حتكون فيها فتحات holes, ولا sometimes إذا كان الكبر باد اللي موجود في البي سي بي، إذا كان الكبر باد هذا ما هو نظيف، فيه a lot of oils من your fingers, it could lead to something like this. Okay. طيب. These steps will try to we'll just look at how can you solder wires. So let's say, for example, if you have a wire like the one we see here, طيب, and you would like to solder هذا copper wire with another copper wire to make a longer extension. The way you can do this is by first heating up the copper wire itself. طبعا you have to cut the wire ولا cut the insulator الموجود على الواير اللي هو هذا اللي بالأسود يعني. طيب, to reveal the copper wire. And once you do that, you heat up a little bit. You heat the iron wire, as you can see here, for roughly 3 to 4 seconds. Once you do this, you put solder على الwire and you spread it along the wire itself. And as you do this, as you spread the solder على الwire, you bring in the other wire and put an iron tip on a solder material. What it will do is it will melt the solder briefly, but it will allow for the other wire to actually merge itself في soldering material, فيصير عندكم في bonding ما between الواير الأول والواير الثاني. And this will be exercised better once we are in our session, inshallah. Now, finally, we come to a portion where what happens if we screw up a connection, for example, within our circuitry, and how can we fix that? Well, there's two options to do that. The first option is by using something defined as a desoldering braid. A desoldering braid is as shown in front of you here. طيب, زي القماش كده مرة سخيف وطويل. What you can do is use this kind of braid as a type كأنها خرقة. طيب, ولا منشفة. البرنسبل هنا إنه أظن yes. Let's say إنه you screwed up مثلا هذا الconnection. You soldered a wrong component and you want to fix it. What you would do is bring هذا braided material. طيب, put it على الsolder ولا على البليس ولا الكوبر بارت اللي فيه الsolder. Then you put an iron tip on top of it to heat up a solder, and once it is melted, هذا braided material will actually absorb a solder, فit will extract a solder out of a circuitry. طيب, كأنه كده زي كأنه منشفة فعلا وكده نصبت موية تحطه ويشفط لك الماتيريال itself. The other method is by utilizing a desoldering sorry مو desoldering, a solder sucker. هذا المفروض مو desoldering, this is called a solder sucker, or ولا احنا ولا the more common word is a solder vacuum. Okay, and the idea هنا, it's very simple. It's a mechanical device where you have a tip shown here. هذا التip. طيب. And the principle of it is that you heat up الsolder اللي موجود على الكوبر. You push هذا البutton in, so it goes all the way in. And once it is melted enough, you press هذا البutton. It will create a vacuum inside that will absorb الماتيريال. That's it. لا أقل ولا أكثر. كأنك تستخدم النيدل حقت النيدل هذه إنك تشفط حاجة. It's very strong and it's very convenient. يعني if you have a lot of mistakes, this is the way to go. If you use a braid, a desoldering braid, it takes ages to get that done. طيب كذا خلصنا السيشن. إن شاء الله إنها كانت خفيفة ولطيفة وإنكم تعلمتوا معلومات جديدة، وإن شاء الله حنحاول نطبق هذه المعلومات وهذه التيبس وهذه التريكس في السيشن itself. وجست to note و to confirm that our first session for الميل tomorrow من الساعة 7:30 للساعة 9:30 هذه إن شاء الله حتكون مقسمة ل 2 sessions. Okay, and then for the female we have 2 separate sessions. السيشن الأول Tuesday من 5 ل 7، السيشن الثاني من 5 ل 7 on Wednesday. Once we start the session inshallah, I will share with you a circuit that we will perform. طيب, it's going to be a simple circuit, يعني something very simple, but it will give you a chance to exercise how can you solder components. فإيش في هنا؟ I remember this. So as a finale لهذا presentation, I would like to say keep calm in solder on engineers. وهذا طبعا quotation mark معناته في أحد، ولا هذه مقولة يعني، وهذه مقولة شخص that was awake at a very late night to get هذا presentation done. I don't have anything else to add here.